A racist cop assaulted a black man inside the courtroom out of pure hate and prejudice, but what he didn't expect was that the black man would fight back, and reveal he was a U.S. Navy SEAL. What happened to that cop left the entire courtroom speechless. It was supposed to be a normal court proceeding. Nothing special. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just another day inside one of the many courtrooms in the country, cold, tense, flooded with fluorescent lights and echoing footsteps. But that morning, something shifted the moment he walked through the front entrance. He wasn't wearing a suit or a tie, no flashy briefcase or fancy watch. Just a quiet, calm presence. Tall, composed, eyes forward. His job? Provide security for a high-profile defense client. But before he could even reach the security line, a single look, one glare from a uniformed man with a badge on his chest and poison in his heart, set everything into motion. The officer didn't hesitate. He stepped forward with false confidence and bitter intent. "Hey," he barked, loud enough for everyone to turn their heads, "what do you think you're doing?" The man paused, politely holding up his credentials, professional, clear. But that wasn't enough. It was never enough. The officer didn't even look at the ID before slapping it to the ground. "This ain't your playground, boy. This is a court of law. You think you can just stroll in here like you run the place?" People stared. Eyes widened. A few gasped, but no one moved. No one stepped in. That's how racism often works, loud in action, quiet in witness. The man stood still, jaw tight, trying to remain composed, but the cop pushed further. "I asked you a question. Are you deaf, or just playing dumb? Speak up when I talk to you. Or better yet, step outside before I make you." And then came the shove. Hard. Uncalled for. His back slammed against the cold marble wall as murmurs rippled through the hallway. Still, the man didn't retaliate. He simply looked the officer dead in the eyes, unwavering. "You really think I don't belong here," he said, voice low but firm. "You really think a man like me can't have business inside this courtroom?" The officer scoffed. "Business? You? You're lucky I don't put you in cuffs right now. I've got the right to remove threats from this building." And then came the final insult. A phrase spat with venom, loud and brutal. "You people don't get to walk around here like you're part of the system. Not in my court." That was it. That was the moment everyone would remember. Not the trial, not the verdict, not the witnesses or lawyers or jury. That moment, when a man in uniform revealed everything wrong with the justice system in just a few hateful words. But what no one expected, was the silence that followed. Because instead of reacting with anger, the man slowly bent down, picked up his credentials, calmly brushed off the dust, and pulled from his back pocket a second ID. One that changed everything. "Let me guess," he said quietly, "you don't read military tags either." The officer blinked, suddenly uneasy. "That badge you wear," the man continued, "I earned one that weighs a hell of a lot more." Someone in the back gasped. Another person pulled out a phone. The courtroom was still, frozen in time. And then it came, a military seal. Gold. Engraved. Deadly serious. He didn't have to say the words. Everyone saw it. U.S. Navy SEAL. Decorated. Experienced. Respected. And still, this man had been shoved, humiliated, mocked, inside a courthouse. Not for what he did. Not for how he acted. But for the color of his skin. The mood shifted in an instant. What was once arrogance in the officer's face turned into confusion, then embarrassment, then something closer to fear. Whispers echoed across the room. "Wait, he's military. Oh my God, is that real? He's a Navy SEAL." The officer tried to save face. "I didn't know," he stammered, backing up slightly. But it was too late. Because now everyone knew. Everyone. And the courtroom that once stared in silent complicity now stood in shock. The man didn't yell. He didn't throw punches. He didn't curse. He just looked at the cop, then turned to the stunned crowd and said something that no one would forget. "You all watched that happen." And no one said a word. Not one. There was no need for more. The silence in the room said everything. But what happened next, what unfolded after this public humiliation, would shake the foundation of that courtroom, and change the trajectory of lives forever. Because just when they thought the worst was over, the judge entered the room. And he had something to say. But who was this judge? And why, the moment he saw the man who had been shoved, did he go pale? Why did he interrupt the proceedings mid-sentence? Why did he look at the officer, and immediately ask him to be escorted out? And what secret, buried in the past, connects this man, the black man they tried to shame, with the very people in power inside that courtroom? The answer to that question is why you need to hear this story until the very last second. Because this wasn't just a case of racism. It was a reckoning. And justice? Justice didn't come with a gavel. It came with truth. Are you ready to find out how it ends? To every black viewer watching this video right now, this story is for you. We stand with you. We see you. And we hear you. Here on Plow of Twist, we strongly condemn any form of racism, prejudice, or injustice. This channel believes in stories that honor truth, dignity, and the power of redemption. Now sit back, take a breath, and get ready for a story that might just shake you. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and let's keep standing strong, together. Enjoy the story. His name was Elijah Moore, and for most of his life, he had been a man of few words and unshakable discipline. Born and raised on the south side of Chicago, Elijah grew up watching his mother juggle 3 jobs while still managing to pack his lunch every morning and check his homework every night. His father, once a community leader and decorated firefighter, was taken too early by a drunk driver when Elijah was just 10 years old. That moment shaped him in ways no one truly understood, not even Elijah himself at the time. Loss hardened him, but it didn't break him. Instead, it lit a fire. A fire that burned with purpose. He wasn't interested in revenge, in lashing out. He wanted to build himself into something no one could dismiss, someone who didn't ask for respect but commanded it simply by standing in the room. Elijah's path to the Navy had been forged through quiet resistance. Teachers underestimated him. Counselors tried to guide him toward safer, more achievable careers. But Elijah knew what he wanted. Discipline, structure, honor. The military offered him that. And not just any branch, he aimed for the most elite, the most demanding. The Navy SEALs. He trained alone at dawn, studied tactics while others partied, and pushed his body to limits no one thought possible. Rejection came the first time he applied. And again the second. But he didn't quit. He kept moving forward, like he always had. On his 3rd attempt, he was accepted. And it changed his life. 15 years of active duty, 10 of those in operations classified so high they barely existed on paper. Elijah saw the world, its beauty and its brutality. He saved lives. He lost brothers. He carried stories that would never be told. Yet, despite the medals, the praise, and the covert heroism, he remained largely invisible in his own country. Back home, he wasn't Lieutenant Elijah Moore, Naval Special Warfare. He was just another black man walking into a building. And that's exactly what happened the morning everything changed. At the time, Elijah had been working in private security for about 6 months. After retiring from the SEALs, he refused to become a talking head or some overpaid tactical advisor for television. He wanted something quiet. Something honest. Providing security for high-profile clients gave him that. No ego. Just protection. That day, his assignment was to escort a well-known defense attorney, an older white man with ties to multiple political and corporate cases, through a tense hearing in the federal courthouse of Richmond, Virginia. A volatile trial involving racial profiling, police misconduct, and a major city official had drawn media attention and protesters. Elijah's job was simple: keep the attorney safe. That was it. He arrived early, as always. No suit. No designer gear. Just a crisp, plain dress shirt, pressed slacks, and a laminated security badge clipped neatly to his waistband. He'd done this 100 times. Nothing seemed unusual. But as he stepped through the revolving glass doors and into the lobby of the courthouse, he noticed something different: the eyes of people following him a little longer than usual, a few whispers exchanged behind front desks, a silence that didn't match the buzz of a public institution. Then came the encounter that shifted the air. Officer Daniel Whitaker had worked security in the courthouse for 17 years. A man in his 50s, tall, broad, and with a face like weathered leather, he carried himself like he owned the floors he walked on. Rumors surrounded him, accusations of excessive force, racially charged comments, silent settlements, but nothing ever stuck. He smiled in front of supervisors, but his tone with black visitors was unmistakable. Elijah didn't know him. But Officer Whitaker knew exactly who he thought Elijah was the moment he saw him walking toward the checkpoint. The way Whitaker stepped in front of him wasn't standard. It was confrontational. Aggressive. Like a predator marking territory. Elijah, calm as ever, extended his hand with the badge, identifying himself and stating his purpose. But Whitaker didn't even glance down. His lip curled. "I didn't ask for your life story. Who said you could come in here dressed like that?" Elijah blinked, unsure if he heard him correctly. "Excuse me?" I said. Whitaker leaned in. "This area is restricted. You think you can walk in here like you belong? You don't. Step back." Several people had turned to watch now. A clerk froze mid-step. A young black intern at the information desk lowered his eyes and slowly backed away. Elijah stayed still. Calm. He repeated his credentials. Whitaker slapped the badge from his hand, letting it clatter on the floor, loud and deliberate. The sound echoed down the marble hall. Then came the shove. A heavy, unnecessary shove that sent Elijah stumbling a step back, bumping into the wall. The moment had gone from inconvenient to intentional. "I don't care what card you show me. You're a threat. And threats don't get access here." In the seconds that followed, no one intervened. Not the second officer on duty. Not the nearby lawyer who watched from the vending machine. Not even the people holding their phones in trembling hands, trying to decide whether to film or pretend it wasn't happening. That was the reality. For someone like Elijah, even decorated valor meant nothing when standing in the wrong skin, in the wrong place, with the wrong person looking at you. And in that moment, his silence said more than any outburst could. The pain wasn't in the shove. It was in the eyes that saw everything, and did nothing. Elijah didn't retaliate. Not yet. He simply picked up his badge from the floor, straightened his posture, and waited. The attorney he was hired to protect hadn't even arrived yet. But the damage was already done. The moment would haunt the lobby's security footage, stain every phone that had recorded it, and burn into the memory of everyone who stood by. But the most unforgettable part wasn't the shove or the insult. It wasn't even the raw injustice or the quiet strength with which Elijah absorbed it. It was what came after. Because inside that courtroom, someone was watching. Someone with power. Someone who recognized Elijah for who he truly was. Someone who shared a piece of history with him that no one else in the room could possibly know. That someone was the judge. And the moment their eyes met across the courtroom floor, something in the judge's demeanor cracked. He stood. He interrupted the proceeding. And everything changed. But before the confrontation could escalate or justice could even begin to surface, there was more to unravel: years of buried truth, past debts, and identities carefully concealed for reasons no one in that building was prepared to understand. The truth wouldn't be revealed all at once. It would come in layers, like smoke clearing from a battlefield. And Elijah Moore, once silent, once invisible, was about to become the center of a storm that would test not just his patience, but the very foundation of power, justice, and who gets to wield it. Because this time, silence would not be enough. This time, he would be seen. The courtroom felt like a cage of held breaths. Elijah stood near the corner, just past the metal detector, silent but unshaken. The room was sterile, wooden benches lined with tension, murmurs of gossip filtering through lips too afraid to speak aloud. The attorney he was assigned to protect finally arrived, a few minutes behind schedule, oblivious at first to the confrontation that had just unfolded. He greeted Elijah with a nod, completely unaware of the humiliation the man had endured. Elijah didn't mention it. Not yet. He simply straightened his stance, checked the hallway, and escorted his client inside the courtroom as if nothing had happened. But inside, something simmered. Quiet. Controlled. Alive. The air in the courtroom shifted the second Elijah stepped in behind the attorney. His presence wasn't subtle. Not because he was loud or disruptive, he wasn't. He didn't even speak. It was his stillness, the strength that radiated from his quiet resolve, that pulled attention like gravity. The gallery turned. Jurors glanced up from their notes. The bailiff, stationed at the front, raised his chin with a look of confusion. But the judge froze. His eyes landed on Elijah, and for a moment, he didn't move. His gavel hovered inches from the block. His lips parted slightly. Then he sat up straight, tapping the gavel softly before glancing down at the docket, like the impact of recognition had momentarily unbalanced him. Elijah's eyes met his for no more than 3 seconds, but in that glance, something unspoken passed between them. A memory, a shared space, or maybe just a recognition of truths neither had said aloud in years. The judge's name was Robert Aldrich. He had a reputation for order, precision, and neutrality. He was respected. Feared, even. But that morning, something in him faltered. The trial began. The case was incendiary, police misconduct, racial profiling, a cover-up involving falsified reports and a teenage boy whose life had been shattered. Emotions were high. Protesters outside the courthouse carried signs demanding justice, while news crews camped along the steps. Inside, arguments flew between the defense and prosecution, each side layered in strategy, veiled manipulation, and the occasional personal jab. Elijah remained silent, standing guard just behind the defense table. But he listened. Every word. Every detail. Not just out of duty, but because he knew the weight of the case. He had lived it in ways no one here could understand. During a recess, Elijah stepped into the hallway to check the perimeter, but was immediately met again by Officer Whitaker. The same arrogance, the same puffed chest. "Still here," he said with a smirk, hands on his belt. "I figured you'd be smart enough to leave after earlier." Elijah stared at him, unmoving. "I'm working." "Yeah. You working security or looking for trouble?" "I said I'm working." Whitaker stepped closer, his voice low now. "Let me give you some advice. People like you don't last long when they step into places they don't belong. You might have slipped through today, but I see everything. I know your type. All pride, no position." Elijah didn't respond. Not with words. He held the officer's gaze, calm and firm, until Whitaker's smirk cracked for just a fraction of a second. Then he walked away, saying over his shoulder, "Don't test me, hero." Back inside the courtroom, things were shifting. The defense team called witnesses, questioned procedures, and laid bare a system riddled with abuse. The victim, a 17-year-old black boy named Jordan, took the stand. His voice trembled, but his story didn't. He spoke about being followed, stopped, slammed against a car, and arrested without explanation. The officer involved had since been relocated, but not reprimanded. Elijah listened to the boy and saw in him echoes of himself at 17, proud, scared, too smart to be ignored, and too black to be safe. Then the prosecution shifted the tone. They brought out character witnesses, attempted to discredit the boy, implying a history of defiance, poor choices, volatile behavior. Elijah felt his fists tighten behind his back. He could see the trap being laid. Twist the narrative. Make the victim look like the threat. He'd seen it too many times. After another recess, Elijah walked to the vending machines for water. A woman in a red blazer approached him, quiet, eyes searching. She was part of the prosecution. "You were in the hallway earlier," she said carefully. "What's your name?" He raised a brow, skeptical. "Why? You didn't look like you appreciated Officer Whitaker's technique." Elijah tilted his head. "What's your point?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. That wasn't his first time doing something like that. "We've had complaints." Internal Affairs opened a file, but they shut it quietly. "He's got friends in high places." Elijah didn't blink. "And you?" "I want to see justice served," she said. "Even if it makes my job harder." Before he could respond, the courtroom doors opened again. Elijah returned to his post. The tension continued to build. The judge became more agitated, more restless. He paused proceedings multiple times to consult notes, mumbled to clerks, snapped at both sides. Something was eating at him, but no one could name it. Then came the moment that shifted everything. A new witness was called. One that neither side expected. A subpoena had gone through earlier that morning, quietly, almost unnoticed. The courtroom stirred when a former police officer stepped forward, a black man, mid-60s, with a limp and tired eyes. He took the stand and began recounting his years in the force. How racism had been embedded in training. How Officer Whitaker had once been his trainee. How he warned superiors of his violent behavior but had been told to let it go. Gasps rippled through the room. Whitaker, standing in the back, turned red. The judge shifted, clearly caught off guard. The testimony continued, painting a picture of a pattern, not an isolated incident. Whitaker's record, sealed complaints, settlements paid out, community mistrust, came bubbling to the surface. But through it all, Elijah stood motionless. Listening. Watching. Absorbing every layer of the story being unearthed around him. Later that afternoon, as the courtroom emptied for the day, Judge Aldridge called a private session. Only key members of both legal teams, security, and Elijah remained. Unexpectedly, he asked Elijah to approach the bench. The room paused. The request was irregular. Out of protocol. But no one objected. Elijah approached, cautious. Judge Aldridge leaned forward, speaking low. "Do you recognize me?" Elijah stared back, measuring every part of the man's face. Something flickered. "I've been trying to place it," the judge continued. "But I know. We served. Different units. Same hell. You saved men I knew. I never forgot your face." The silence that followed was heavy. "You don't have to say anything," the judge said. "But I will." He stood, his voice steady but charged. "This case has become more than evidence. It's about conscience. It's about truth. And I won't let it die in silence." Elijah didn't respond. He didn't have to. The storm was already coming. You could feel it in the walls. The final day of testimony was set for tomorrow. And what no one knew, was that tomorrow, everything would break wide open. What had been buried would rise. And justice would look nothing like they expected. The courtroom was thick with anticipation. The air felt denser than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Reporters, activists, legal observers, and even federal officers had made their way into the room, sensing that what was about to happen would echo beyond this courthouse, beyond this city. The final day of testimony had arrived, but something intangible had shifted. It wasn't just the pressure of a verdict. It was the awareness that someone in this room was about to fall, and someone else was about to rise. Elijah stood in his usual place, back straight, expression unreadable, but this time, he wasn't just a bodyguard. And soon, everyone would know that. Judge Aldridge entered through the private door with a solemn expression. No unnecessary words, no acknowledgement of the murmurs that rippled through the room. His robe seemed heavier on his shoulders, his steps more deliberate. As he settled into his chair, he glanced briefly toward Elijah, subtle, quiet, but with a weight behind his eyes that couldn't be missed. Elijah didn't move. He waited. Patient as ever. The prosecution called their final witness, expecting to close the case with technicality and procedure. But as soon as they rested, the defense attorney stood and surprised everyone by calling an unexpected name. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "we'd like to call Mr. Elijah Moore to the stand." Gasps scattered through the room like glass breaking. Elijah didn't flinch. The judge blinked slowly, visibly thrown, but didn't object. He turned toward Elijah, nodded once. Elijah stepped forward, each movement slow, composed, undeniable. His boots echoed across the hardwood floor as he approached the witness stand. And suddenly, the man everyone had overlooked became the center of the storm. He was sworn in with a steady hand. The courtroom had never been quieter. The defense attorney began gently. "Mr. Moore, please state your occupation." Elijah looked out across the courtroom, then toward the jury. "I work in private security." "And before that?" "I served in the United States Navy. 15 years. 10 as a SEAL." A ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. The attorney continued. "Are you familiar with Officer Daniel Whitaker?" "Yes," Elijah said. "He assaulted me inside this courthouse." "And can you describe the circumstances?" Elijah leaned forward slightly. "I was providing protection for the defense team. I followed protocol. I identified myself, presented credentials. He refused to acknowledge them. Then he escalated, verbally, then physically. He shoved me against a wall and implied I didn't belong here." The attorney nodded. "Was this your first interaction with him?" "Yes." "Did you provoke him in any way?" "No." The room was frozen. Every eye locked on him. Then the attorney paused. "Mr. Moore, were you aware that Officer Whitaker has a documented history of excessive force and racial misconduct?" "I am now," Elijah replied evenly. "And how did this event affect you?" Elijah paused for the first time. His voice dropped lower. "It reminded me that no matter what I've done for this country, what I've sacrificed, some people still only see a threat when they look at me. Not a man. Not a soldier. Just a color." A woman in the jury box blinked hard, visibly affected. The judge shifted in his seat. The prosecutor stood, clearly rattled. "Your Honor, this testimony is irrelevant to the case at hand." The judge turned slowly. "Overruled. Let him speak." The prosecutor pressed on. "Mr. Moore, what does your personal experience have to do with this case?" Elijah didn't wait for the attorney to respond. "Because it's not personal. It's a pattern. You want to talk about this case as if it exists in a vacuum. It doesn't. This courthouse is supposed to be about truth. But the truth is, this isn't the first time justice's face has been blurred by bias. And I'm not the only one it's happened to." The silence that followed was electric. Then came the moment no one expected. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Moore, may I ask you something directly?" Elijah turned toward him. "Yes, sir." "Do you remember Operation Rivergate?" Elijah's eyes narrowed. The room didn't understand, but something between them did. I do, Elijah said slowly. You saved 3 men in that mission. One of them was me. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. The judge lifted a hand to silence them, but his voice cracked with something raw and old. I've carried guilt for years that I never thanked you. I wasn't strong enough then to face what I've carried since. But when I saw you in this courtroom, standing in silence after being humiliated by a man who should have never worn a badge, something inside me broke. The prosecutor stood in disbelief. Your Honor, with all due respect, sit down, the judge said, his voice thunderous now. You will sit down and listen. No one dared move. The judge's voice dropped again. This man saved my life in a place where there was no law, no order. Just chaos. He didn't ask who I was or what I believed. He just acted. And to see him treated like a criminal inside a courtroom, this courtroom, it's a disgrace I won't ignore. Whitaker, seated near the rear, stood suddenly, voice raised. I didn't know who he was. The judge glared at him. That's the point. You didn't care. Because to you, he didn't deserve basic respect. Whitaker turned red. I was following procedure, you were following prejudice, the judge said, his voice a knife. And this court sees through you now. The tension exploded. Reporters scrambled for their devices. The jury sat in stunned silence. Whitaker turned toward the doors, ready to leave, but 2 federal marshals intercepted him before he could take a step. One of them was black. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The judge took a breath. Effective immediately, Officer Daniel Whitaker is to be placed under investigation for civil rights violations, assault, and professional misconduct. He is hereby suspended from any duties related to this court until further notice. He turned back to Elijah. You may step down. And thank you. For everything. Elijah stood slowly, descending the witness stand without a glance toward Whitaker. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just walked back to his place beside the defense attorney, the weight of justice finally beginning to shift. But something deeper had been stirred in that room, something that would leave a scar, and maybe a path toward healing. But it wasn't over yet. Because as the room began to move again, and the judge prepared to adjourn, another name was called. One that wasn't on the docket. And when the judge saw who entered the courtroom, his expression changed. Something else was coming. And it wasn't done rewriting the story yet. The doors creaked open with a slow, deliberate groan that seemed to slice through the stillness like a blade. Heads turned. The gavel hadn't fallen yet. The judge remained seated, halfway into his declaration of adjournment, but something about the presence stepping into the room made even him pause. A tall woman entered, dressed in a dark navy suit with a folder clutched tight to her chest, her expression stern but unreadable. The air shifted again. Not because of her appearance, but because of the badge clipped to her side and the sharp confidence in her steps. Department of Justice. Her gaze locked on Judge Aldridge as she approached the bench without being asked, her movements calm but purposeful. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear, with all due respect, this hearing isn't over. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. The judge sat back, expression tightening. You are. She didn't blink. Special Agent Tiana Reynolds, Civil Rights Division. I'm here on orders from Washington. We've received evidence within the past 48 hours concerning Officer Daniel Whitaker that goes beyond the scope of today's proceedings. I've been authorized to present this information directly to the court. The judge nodded slowly. Proceed. Agent Reynolds opened the folder and slid a series of documents to the clerk. Multiple sealed complaints were buried by local law enforcement and district court administrators over the past 7 years, all concerning Officer Whitaker. The pattern is consistent: excessive use of force, racially charged language, targeting of Black and Latino individuals in public spaces, intimidation, and falsified reports. In 2 of the cases, the victims filed formal grievances but were paid off and silenced under threat of legal retaliation. The courtroom was silent, save for the flipping of paper and the scratching of pens. But then Agent Reynolds did something no one expected. She turned to Elijah. One of those sealed reports included a confidential military profile, yours. Elijah's brows drew together. I never filed a report. No, she said softly, but someone else did. 4 years ago, a former Marine named Andre Mathis witnessed Whitaker confront you off-duty in D.C., while you were attending a fundraiser in uniform. You defused the situation, walked away. But Mathis reported it. That complaint disappeared 2 weeks later. Elijah exhaled slowly, his fists flexing at his sides. I didn't know. We believe the suppression of that report was intentional. A pattern of erasing misconduct to protect the badge. It fits with the behavior displayed in this courtroom. The judge spoke carefully now. What are you asking, Agent Reynolds? She didn't hesitate. That this court formally refer Officer Whitaker to the federal prosecutor's office for investigation and immediate charges. And that any cases involving his testimony or arrest record be reviewed for systemic bias. Whitaker, seated between 2 marshals now, leaned forward in disbelief. This is a setup. I've done my job for nearly 2 decades. You're going to burn me over what, one bad judgment? Elijah turned then, slowly, his voice low but full. One bad judgment. You assaulted me in a federal building. You looked at me like I was nothing. Like the uniform I wore meant nothing. Like the lives I risked didn't count. That wasn't a mistake. That was who you are. Whitaker's voice cracked with rage. You're playing victim now. I was doing my job. No, Elijah interrupted, his tone cutting. Your job is to protect and serve, not target and humiliate. You looked me in the eye and called me a threat without knowing my name, my story, or my service. And you did it like it was routine. Like you'd done it 100 times before. The judge slammed his gavel down once. That's enough. Mr. Whitaker, you are no longer permitted to speak in this court. Elijah's breathing was steady, but his heart pounded beneath the fabric of his shirt. The rage he'd held in for years wasn't loud. It was silent, tempered, simmering beneath every word he chose with precision. The judge turned back to Agent Reynolds. The court grants your motion. All evidence will be submitted for federal review. This proceeding is now officially extended. But there was still more. As the marshals began to escort Whitaker out, another voice rose from the gallery. A woman. Young. Shaky. She stood up, hand trembling as she held her phone. I have something, she said. I didn't mean to get involved, but I recorded something last week. I didn't know what it meant then, but now. I think it matters. The judge looked toward her. Approach. She walked forward slowly, unlocking her phone. I work down at the records office. I saw Officer Whitaker and another man, I think he's with the court's legal counsel, talking about how to clean up files before the trial. I didn't know what they were doing, but I recorded it. Just in case. The judge took the phone. Played the recording. Whitaker's voice was unmistakable. Delete it. I don't care how. No trace. If this gets out, I'm done. A silence deeper than anything that had come before settled over the room. The judge's jaw clenched. Clerk, place that audio into the official record. Agent Reynolds, I trust this will be included in your investigation. She nodded. Absolutely. Elijah sat down slowly, the weight of what was unraveling settling into his chest. This wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. The systems that allowed men like Whitaker to thrive were being dragged into the light, one corrupt thread at a time. After a long pause, Judge Aldridge leaned forward again, speaking not just as a judge, but as a man. This court failed to protect those it was meant to serve. And I failed to recognize a hero when he stood before me in silence. Mr. Moore, on behalf of this court and this nation, you deserved better. Elijah didn't respond. He simply nodded. That was enough. As the courtroom began to clear, reporters flooded the hallway. Activists outside chanted Elijah's name. For the first time in his life, people weren't looking through him. They were seeing him. But the true weight of the moment came later, in a quiet hallway behind the courtroom. Judge Aldridge approached him privately. I've spent years hiding behind neutrality, pretending it made me fair. But justice isn't passive. Sometimes it demands that we choose. Elijah looked at him. You chose today. That matters. I only chose because you stood still long enough for us to see the truth, the judge replied. They shook hands, firm, honest, complete. Outside, the city buzzed with questions, headlines, and hope. Inside, Elijah stood still one last time, before walking forward again. And justice, for once, followed him. The courtroom had emptied, but its silence still lingered like the echo of thunder. The marble walls that had once absorbed years of indifference and systemic oversight now seemed to reverberate with the weight of truth exposed. The revelation wasn't just about a single corrupt officer or an act of violence. It had become the peeling back of a larger rot, one that had embedded itself deeply into the very floorboards of justice. For Elijah, walking out of that courtroom wasn't triumph. It was complicated. There were no parades, no applause. Just breath. The kind of breath that tastes different after you've finally been seen for who you really are. Outside, the media had descended like vultures and doves alike, swarming the steps for quotes, reaction, validation. Elijah refused to speak to them. Not because he was ungrateful, but because this moment wasn't about spectacle. It wasn't performance. It was survival being acknowledged in a space where it had long been denied. He left through a side exit with Agent Reynolds by his side. They didn't speak at first. The wind was cold, brushing past them like it, too, needed to clear away everything that had been stirred up. At the edge of the lot, Elijah finally broke the silence. You really think something will come of this? Agent Reynolds didn't flinch. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. He glanced at her. You've probably seen worse. I've seen different, she said, pausing. But this was personal for too many people. That courtroom became a mirror, and a lot of people didn't like what they saw in their reflection. Elijah nodded slowly. And Whitaker? He'll be prosecuted, she replied. Federal level. The charges will stick this time. The audio sealed it. The judge's admission sealed it. And the truth, you standing there the way you did, that made it impossible to ignore. But despite the assurance, Elijah's chest remained tight. It wasn't vengeance he wanted. It wasn't even justice in the textbook sense. It was acknowledgement. It was the desire for systems to work the way they claimed they did, for decency to be real, not theoretical. And he knew how many times people like Whitaker slipped through the cracks, protected by silence, bureaucracy, and fear. In the following days, the courthouse became a center of national attention. Journalists unpacked the footage from Elijah's testimony, social media erupted with demands for reform, and old cases involving Whitaker were pulled from the shadows by legal advocacy groups. Families stepped forward, some in tears, others with quiet fury, sharing stories that had long been buried under shame and fatigue. The courthouse, once a symbol of control and order, had become the stage for a reckoning it never saw coming. Judge Aldridge, meanwhile, was placed under temporary review, not because of his actions during the trial, but because he had, for too long, remained silent in the face of a system he knew was flawed. That internal investigation created mixed reactions. Some praised him for finally stepping forward, for choosing justice over reputation. Others asked why it had taken a man nearly being assaulted in his court to awaken his conscience. Elijah didn't give public comment. But in private, he knew the truth: redemption is only meaningful when it comes at a cost. And the judge had chosen to pay it. Elijah returned home to Chicago a week later. The neighborhood hadn't changed much, kids still playing on the same cracked sidewalks, murals faded but still vibrant, corner stores buzzing with chatter. But this time, something felt different. People looked at him differently. Not with fear, not with awe, but with pride. Quiet nods on the street. Strangers shaking his hand. Elders calling him young blood with a kind of reverence. They had seen him, not on TV, not in a headline, but seen him stand firm against the kind of humiliation they'd all known too well. One night, sitting on the porch with his mother, Elijah said little. She watched him with the same eyes that had seen him off to boot camp and welcomed him home with tears and gumbo. "You did good," she said softly. "I'm not sure what I did," he replied. "It wasn't supposed to be about me." "It never is," she said, sipping her tea. "But when you carry yourself the way you did, people take notice. And when you speak the way you did, people remember." The days passed, and something began to build, not closure, but purpose. Elijah started receiving letters. From veterans. From students. From inmates. From officers. Each one was different, but all of them echoed the same sentiment: "You gave me a voice." He hadn't expected that. He hadn't prepared for the emotional weight of becoming a symbol. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. He wanted to live a life where dignity didn't have to be earned or defended with pain. Then came the invitation. A law enforcement academy in Virginia asked Elijah to speak. Not just to cadets, but to a joint session of trainers, supervisors, and department heads. He hesitated. The thought of walking back into a space full of uniforms, the same kind that had once shoved him, doubted him, dismissed him, tightened something in his gut. But he said yes. He stood in front of them, months later, in a plain black shirt and jeans. No military ribbons. No suit. Just him. Real. Grounded. "You don't know me," he began. "And I'm not here to make you feel good." Silence. "I'm not here because I want revenge, or attention, or praise. I'm here because I want to live in a country where my nephews don't flinch when they see a badge. I want to walk into a building and not be treated like a problem before I open my mouth. I want people like the kid in that courtroom, Jordan, to grow up knowing that the people sworn to protect him actually believe his life is worth protecting." A few heads bowed. Some stiffened. But others nodded, slowly, pens in hand, absorbing each syllable. "You don't have to be a racist to be part of a racist system," he continued. "But you do have to decide if you're going to stay quiet in it. I've worn a uniform. I know what it means to hold someone's life in your hands. It's not a right. It's a responsibility. And if you don't get that, you shouldn't be wearing a badge." When he finished, the applause was hesitant. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because it hurt to clap with truth ringing in your ears. Painful truth. Necessary truth. Later, a young cadet approached him privately. Barely 20. Nervous. Eyes wide. "I never heard someone say it like that before," he said. "It's not how they teach it." Elijah looked at him and said, "Then teach yourself. And teach others. That's how this changes." But change doesn't come easy. And it doesn't come all at once. In the months that followed, Elijah remained at the center of a conversation he never asked to start. A national panel requested his input on police reform. Legal organizations asked him to sit on advisory boards. Offers came from networks, politicians, think tanks. He declined most. Not because he didn't believe in the work, but because he didn't want his pain turned into profit. What he did accept was the opportunity to speak in communities like his own, helping others navigate a system designed to overlook them. But through all the noise, one decision kept circling in his mind. A dilemma that twisted itself in silence. Should he press charges personally against Officer Whitaker? The system was already pursuing justice. The agent was building a federal case. The world had seen what happened. But would pressing charges be a stand, or would it be vengeance dressed as principle? He brought the question to his mother, who listened quietly. "What are you afraid of?" she asked. "I'm not afraid," Elijah said, but the words didn't feel honest. "I just don't want to lose myself trying to fight for something that already broke me." His mother reached out, took his hand. "Baby, sometimes healing looks like fighting. And sometimes it looks like walking away. But don't let anyone tell you they're the same thing." So he waited. He watched the process unfold. He waited until the evidence was public, until the investigation solidified, until the courtroom that had once been his battlefield turned into the place where consequences finally caught up to those who never expected them. And just before the verdict on Whitaker was announced, Elijah made his choice. One that would silence some, anger others, but ultimately show who he truly was. Because the final move wasn't about winning. It was about becoming something even more powerful than the system that tried to erase him. And what he did next, no one saw coming. The day before the verdict, Elijah sat alone in a small room off the edge of his mother's home, a place that used to be his father's den. The leather chair creaked beneath him, and the hum of the old ceiling fan stirred dust into lazy circles overhead. He stared at the letter in his hand, the official court notice informing him of his right to press individual civil charges against Daniel Whitaker. The ink was black, the language neutral, but the weight of it was thick. It was an open door to something personal. A reckoning with the man who had tried to humiliate him in front of the world. A moment to reclaim agency not just as a symbol of justice, but as a man who had been wronged. But the real question wasn't whether he had the right, it was whether it would heal anything. He folded the paper slowly and placed it back on the table. It sat there like a decision waiting to be spoken aloud. That night, he walked the neighborhood quietly, passing stoops where elders whispered and nodded as he passed, crossing streets where kids played basketball until the last breath of daylight slipped below the horizon. He moved with the kind of weight that wasn't seen but felt. When he reached the old train bridge, he stopped, resting both hands on the rusted railing, looking out at nothing in particular. The whistle of a far-off train pierced the night air. Behind him, footsteps approached, and a familiar voice broke the silence. "You always disappear right before something big," said the voice. It was Marcus, his childhood best friend, now a local organizer and high school coach. Marcus stood beside him, watching the same invisible point on the horizon. "I don't like big," Elijah replied. "Big usually means loud. Too many people talking, not enough listening." Marcus smirked. "Funny. 'Cause you got the whole damn country listening right now." Elijah shook his head. "That's the problem. They're listening now, but where were they before?" "Don't ask questions you already know the answers to," Marcus said. "The point is, they're listening now because you didn't fold. Because you stayed standing." Elijah was quiet. Then he asked, "Do you think I should go through with it?" Marcus took a breath. "If you're asking me whether that man deserves to be held accountable, then yes. Hell yes. But if you're asking whether you need this to be whole, that's different. Only you know if putting him on trial again will give you peace, or just drag you back into something you already survived." Elijah looked down at his hands. "I'm tired, man. I've fought my whole life. I fought in deserts, in jungles, in cities I can't name. I came home thinking I could finally breathe. And the first thing I get is shoved into a wall like I'm a threat to my own country." Marcus's voice softened. "You ain't a threat, Eli. You're a mirror. You made people see what they've been trying to ignore. That's why they're scared. That's why it matters." Elijah didn't respond. He just stayed there for a long while, letting the cold creep into his bones. The next morning, the courtroom was smaller than before. Not physically, but in presence. The media had mostly cleared, attention having shifted to newer fires, different headlines. But inside, it was intimate now. Real. The kind of quiet that speaks louder than any camera flash. Judge Aldridge looked older that morning. Not in years, but in wear. His eyes searched the room as if he were looking for something he'd lost along the way. When Whitaker entered, he no longer carried the weight of command. His uniform was gone, replaced with a dull gray suit that didn't quite fit. The arrogance had been stripped from his shoulders. What remained was a man backed into a corner of his own making. Elijah sat behind the prosecution, silent, watching. The court clerk called the session to order, and the judge read through the charges: official, factual, cold. Assault. Misconduct. Abuse of power. Civil rights violations. Then came the unexpected. The judge turned to Elijah and addressed him directly in open court. "Mr. Moore," he said, his voice steady, "before we proceed to sentencing, the court recognizes your right to present a personal statement. Do you wish to speak?" Elijah stood slowly. His steps were measured. Not dramatic. Just honest. He walked to the front, hands folded loosely in front of him, eyes never leaving the judge's face. "I've had a lot of time to think," he began. "About what justice really means. About what happens after the headlines fade and the noise dies down. I've been asked if I want to press charges. If I want to see this man punished further. And for a while, I didn't know. I wrestled with it. I sat with the anger, the embarrassment, the weight of standing still while being torn down in front of people who said nothing." He paused, turning slightly toward Whitaker. "You took something from me that day," Elijah continued. "You took a piece of dignity I've spent my whole life building. You saw my skin and decided I didn't belong. And when I stood still, you pushed harder. Because you thought the world would back you up. Because it always has." Whitaker looked away, jaw tight. "But I'm not here to destroy you," Elijah said. "That would be too easy. I'm here to show that even after everything you did, even after you tried to strip me down to nothing, I'm still standing. And not because of you. In spite of you." He turned back to the judge. "I've decided not to file personal charges. Because this system needs more than another name on a docket. It needs change. And that change won't come from revenge. It'll come from reform. From responsibility. From people like me being in rooms we've always been locked out of." Judge Aldridge nodded slowly, visibly moved. Elijah stepped back to his seat. Whitaker was sentenced shortly after. 2 years federal. Stripped of all law enforcement certification. Mandatory bias rehabilitation and community service in underserved areas. It wasn't what some would call justice. But it was accountability. And it was more than anyone had expected when this all began. After the hearing, Whitaker was escorted through the same hallway Elijah had walked weeks before. Only this time, he wasn't the one pushing through people. He was the one being watched. Measured. Judged. The look in his eyes was different now. Not fear. Not even remorse. But awareness. The sharp, cold realization that the world had changed without asking his permission. Later that evening, Elijah received a call. It was from Jordan, the young man whose case had sparked the original trial. His voice was quiet, uncertain. "I saw what you did," Jordan said. "I watched it all. I don't know how you stood up there like that." Elijah smiled faintly. "You'll learn. When the moment comes, you'll know." "I think I want to be a lawyer," Jordan said. "Not because I believe in the system. But because someone has to fight from the inside." Elijah's heart tightened. "Then fight. Just don't lose yourself in the process." "I won't," Jordan said. "Not after seeing you." After the call, Elijah sat alone again. No lights on. No noise. Just the quiet understanding that something had shifted. Not just in the courtroom, not just in the city, but inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had turned the corner on a long road. The kind of road where justice isn't a destination, but a direction. And tomorrow, he'd keep walking. Not as a soldier. Not as a victim. But as a man rebuilding something bigger than himself. Piece by piece. Step by step. Toward a future no one would ever again say he didn't belong in. Weeks passed, but the echoes of the courtroom still lingered in Elijah's chest like a second heartbeat. The rhythm of ordinary life resumed around him, horns honking on the street, kids chasing basketballs down cracked pavement, corner stores buzzing with small talk and tired laughter, but inside, something remained unsettled. Not broken. Not raw. Just shifting. Like a wound that had finally begun to scar, but still stung when touched. Elijah had returned to his routines. Morning runs at dawn. Sessions at the local gym where he now volunteered with returning veterans. Evening meals at his mother's table. Yet everywhere he went, people carried their eyes differently when they looked at him. Not like he was a hero. Not like he was a symbol. But like he was something that had survived. And in neighborhoods like his, survival was never small. One afternoon, while coaching a self-defense class at the community center, Elijah noticed a young man lingering at the edge of the room. He wasn't dressed for training. No gloves. No gear. Just jeans, a hoodie, and a notebook clutched like a shield. Elijah approached between drills, wiping sweat from his brow with a towel. "You here for the class?" he asked, voice even but inviting. The kid shook his head. "I don't fight." Elijah nodded. "A lot of people don't, until they need to." "I just wanted to ask something," the kid said, eyes darting around. "About the courtroom." "About, what happened?" Elijah crossed his arms, patient. "Go ahead." The kid hesitated. Then asked, "How do you know when to forgive someone who doesn't ask for it?" Elijah blinked slowly. That wasn't the question he expected. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Is this about Whitaker?" The kid shook his head. "It's about my father." That made Elijah pause. The room faded for a moment as the weight of the question took root in his chest. He remembered the bitterness he'd once carried for the man who killed his father. The sleepless nights. The numb courtrooms. The long drive back home after a sentencing that never felt like closure. "You don't forgive people for them," Elijah said quietly. "You do it so you can stop bleeding every time their name is mentioned." The kid's eyes welled slightly, and he nodded. Then, just as quickly, turned and left. Elijah didn't stop him. Some pain needed space to breathe before it could begin to heal. Later that evening, Elijah sat with Marcus again, this time at a small restaurant on 51st and Langley where the waitress knew them by name. Over greasy plates and cold sodas, the conversation turned serious. "You ever think about how many Whitakers there still are?" Marcus asked, stirring his drink with a straw he didn't sip. "All the time," Elijah replied. "And it doesn't make you want to scream?" "Sometimes," Elijah admitted. "But screaming only echoes. I'd rather build something that lasts." Marcus nodded. "I've been thinking, man. About starting a program. Not just for kids. For cops. Real training. Not just how to shoot. But how to see. How to unlearn." Elijah leaned in, his eyes sharpening. "You serious?" "Dead serious. I've got a few connections. A councilwoman who owes me a favor. But I need someone they'll listen to. Someone who's already changed the story." Elijah sat back, considering. He didn't want to be the face of another project that fizzled out once the headlines cooled. But Marcus wasn't just anyone. He was soil deep. Committed. Real. "Let's write it up," Elijah said finally. "But we do it our way. No performative panels. No political lip service. Only purpose, Marcus said, smiling. The next few weeks became a whirlwind of planning. Meetings with city officials. Sit-downs with precinct captains. Drafting a curriculum that combined tactical empathy with scenario-based de-escalation. Elijah poured himself into it, not because he believed the system would change overnight, but because he knew change only happened when someone refused to stop knocking on the door. And this time, the knock came from a man who had already been denied entry once, and stood taller because of it. But amid the momentum, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived. No return address. Just his name. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but inside was a note written with clarity and humility. It was from the officer who had arrested Whitaker during the trial, the black marshal who had walked him out with a stoicism that struck Elijah even in the moment. The letter explained how that day had been the first time in years that the officer had felt proud of wearing his badge. He admitted that he'd nearly quit the force 3 months earlier. Said he felt like he was betraying his own people every time he walked into the precinct. But seeing Elijah stand there, calm in the face of rage, unbroken in the shadow of injustice, had given him something to hold on to. The last line read, "You didn't raise your voice. But you made us hear. Thank you." Elijah folded the letter carefully, placed it in the top drawer of his desk, and sat in silence for a long time. Not because he was overwhelmed, but because he knew this moment was bigger than one case, one man, or one courtroom. It was about the legacy of what we leave behind when we choose to respond to violence with vision. Eventually, the pilot training program launched. They called it Stand Ground, not in the weaponized sense that so often justified fear, but in the spiritual sense, teaching officers, youth, and community leaders how to stand their ground in truth, in equity, in accountability. Elijah co-facilitated the sessions with Marcus, blending combat-tested experience with street-level wisdom. The first class was small, only 12 participants. But by the end of the month, there was a waiting list. Departments across the state started taking notice. Not because they were being forced, but because word had spread that this was different. Real. Uncomfortable, but necessary. During one session, an older white officer stood up after an exercise and admitted, voice shaking, that he had gone his entire career without realizing how afraid he was of the people he was supposed to serve. He said he'd spent years confusing dominance for control. And that Elijah's story had made him question everything. When the session ended, he approached Elijah directly. "I want to say I'm sorry," he said. Elijah looked him in the eye. "I don't need your apology. I need your change." The officer nodded. "Then I'll work on that." One night, after a long session, Elijah found himself alone again in the center's locker room. The mirrors were fogged from the steam, the buzz of the old vending machine filling the silence. He sat on the bench, towel around his shoulders, and for a brief moment, let himself feel tired, not just physically, but emotionally. He thought about all the rooms he had stood in where his presence was questioned. All the doors he had been forced to knock on twice. All the spaces he had to shrink himself to enter. And now, here he was, rebuilding those spaces from the inside. His phone buzzed. A message from Jordan. It read, "Passed my LSAT. Applying to Howard Law. Thank you for everything." Elijah smiled softly. Another knock answered. Another door opening. And still, the work continued. The story wasn't over. Because justice isn't a moment. It's a movement. And Elijah Moore had become the man who would keep it moving. Elijah stood at the edge of the stage, a modest spotlight casting a soft glow across his face as he prepared to speak at the National Justice Reform Summit held in Washington, D.C. It wasn't a stage built for show, it was one shaped by experience, lined with people who had either endured injustice, fought against it, or were still trying to understand their place within it. The applause that welcomed him was honest, not performative. And when it faded, Elijah let the silence speak first. He didn't need to command attention. He had become the kind of man whose presence alone invited stillness. He spoke not about what had happened to him, but about what had grown from it. He spoke of pain as a teacher, not a sentence. Of strength that doesn't rise from anger, but from clarity. He shared how the fire of injustice can burn you hollow or forge you into something unshakable. And when he finished, he left the stage without waiting for cheers. His message wasn't meant for applause. It was meant to land in the hearts of those who knew too well how heavy silence could be. After the summit, Elijah was offered a formal advisory role on a national board overseeing police training standards across the country. It was a position of influence, but more than that, it was a position where his lived experience became policy, where his truth would shape the very systems that once tried to deny it. He accepted, not for prestige, but for purpose. And with that, he quietly began helping redesign the spaces that had once excluded men like him, creating a ripple that reached farther than he could have imagined. Jordan, now deep into his first semester at Howard Law, called him one late night in October, his voice filled with excitement and disbelief. He'd just been accepted as a junior advisor on a civil liberties case that could set precedent in multiple states. Elijah listened quietly, smiling to himself, pride humming in his chest. Jordan had once been a boy the system tried to erase. Now, he was becoming the kind of man who would defend those still being written off. It wasn't just redemption. It was continuation. Legacy. Marcus training program, Stand Ground, was now active in 3 states, with national grants pouring in. Cities that once resisted the idea of reform were reaching out, asking for help building a new kind of culture, one rooted in mutual respect, emotional intelligence, and above all, accountability. Marcus never stopped reminding Elijah that none of it would have started without him stepping forward when the world expected him to sit in silence. Their partnership had become more than friendship, it had become movement. As for Whitaker, the justice system moved as it always did, slowly, but with finality. He served his sentence quietly. No media interviews. No statements. In one of life's strange ironies, he was assigned to perform his community service hours under the very same program Elijah and Marcus had founded. He didn't recognize Elijah the first time they crossed paths during an outreach event in Detroit. His hair had grayed, his shoulders slouched, his voice small. When realization dawned in his eyes, it wasn't met with rage or shame, it was met with something harder to define. Something closer to reckoning. Elijah walked up to him, offered a bottle of water, and said, "We don't need to talk. Just work." Whitaker nodded, took the bottle, and for the first time in his life, listened without speaking. The true victory, Elijah knew, wasn't in breaking a man down. It was in building a system where even the ones who failed it had to face what they tried to ignore. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Elijah stood once more in the den of his childhood home. The framed photo of his father still rested on the shelf, smiling, proud, eternal. His mother hummed in the kitchen, the scent of fresh cornbread drifting through the air. Everything was still. And in that stillness, he felt something rare. Peace. Not because the world was fixed. But because he had chosen not to let it break him. Now, to you, the one listening, the one who's followed this journey to the end, what would you have done if you were in Elijah's place? Would you have stood still and stayed silent? Would you have fought back in rage or walked away in defeat? Would you have found the strength to transform humiliation into purpose? These are not easy questions. They're not meant to be. Because justice isn't just about what happens in courtrooms. It's about what we carry with us when no one is watching. It's about what we choose to stand for when the world tells us to sit down. And it's about what kind of legacy we leave behind, not in words, but in impact. So take a moment. Reflect on what you've heard. Ask yourself what silence you've been keeping. What doors you've yet to open. And most importantly, how will you use your voice when the time comes? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something deep and real, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it forward. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that shake, stir, and speak truth. Leave a like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and join a community that believes every twist of fate deserves to be heard. Your story matters. Just like Elijah's.